Welcome to Propaganda Loves You, a show that asks and answers the question, if Columbus was such a great guy, why did he genocide all of the Arawaks? I'm Joe, your host for this week. I'm joined by Kodie and Arthur. We're big boys with big feelings about history, and today we're going to talk about them.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So how's your guys' week going other than all the terrible stuff that's going on, like outside of that?
Yeah, it's been good. It's been like hectic, and the news cycle has been particularly dark. But I felt really good when they posted about that Kilmar García, just like the fact that he's alive. So a little uplifted to that.
Yeah, I was super happy to see that they were actually able to see him. That was pretty concerning when he first went down and they just like denied any entrance or any meeting at all. Yeah, I was pretty concerned at that point too. I think. But yeah,
like they wouldn't let the Democrats see inside. Of course, they brought him to the hotel, like dressed up.
Yeah, photo op, and then the follow-on tweets from was it Bukele? Is that how you say his name? The president of El Salvador. Yeah, it was basically like, just tweeting out, oh, you see, he's fine afterwards. It was like you went from, so total photo op there. But yeah, that entire thing is just absolutely insane. Like that we're at the point here. Like I wanted to talk about this anyway, but sorry, before I kind of ramble more. Joe, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about how messed up and fascinating it is how our culture like glorifies punishment in this way, like perp walks and media presentations of criminal. Like I'm just thinking of Eric Adams walking behind Luigi Mangione, like just trying to be like a badass, I got the bad guy kind of thing. You see a similar kind of macho bullshit going on with Trump and the other guy. I don't get it how we just really glorify punishing people in this, I don't know, brutal way. It's just kind of nasty. But no, I've been good this week. Yeah, I've been relaxed. I've been doing like I've decided to not be on the scrolling sites as much, and so I'm trying not to look at news feeds and stuff like that and just watch Democracy Now! In the morning. Like they do the headlines for like 15 or 20 minutes, and I'm like, okay, I stay up to date. I see all the big stuff going on, but I'm not like scrolling relentlessly throughout the day. I'm more focused on my own stuff, and so the world sucks, but I've been feeling a little bit better this week for myself.
Good.
Growing up, Amy Goodman was such an icon for me. I loved her. Democracy Now!
I love Amy.
Maybe we should talk about that sometime, Joe. Just like how do you pick like the couple things that you're going to pay attention to, and how do you kind of not ignore, but just like not obsess about everything else? Like that would be something that would be great to just dive into, and like, because there's so much out there, you can just get overwhelmed. Actually, I think when we talk about like the disinformation episode, that's going to be a big part of it. There's a reason that there's so much out there.
Yeah, you got to be realistic about how much time you have, what your skills actually are, what can you contribute to the world, and like understand what's going on, but stay focused. Don't worry too much about the stuff you can't control, but still try to do something to help. I don't know. It feels good to do a little good in some way, and then you feel a little better about not obsessively checking the news all the time.
We had a 9-0 Supreme Court decision recently, and I actually don't know how long it's been since we had a 9-0 decision. I'm sure there's some stuff that's we've had like a pretty easy call on before. I think I'm gonna just do a really short recap of this case as far as I know it, and you guys correct me if I get anything wrong here. So, Kilmar García was detained by ICE and deported to El Salvador on accusations that he was a MS-13 gang member. But previously, before that even happened, he was under protective court order in the United States to not return to El Salvador because he was under threat from gang violence in that country. And I don't think there was ever I think there was accusations of MS-13 involvement. I need to check that and confirm that didn't actually get like confirmed there. But either way, that doesn't matter. And the reason I say that doesn't matter is because what occurred was this deportation was challenged in court. It eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court laid down a 9-0 decision that the administration had to facilitate the return of Kilmar García back to the United States. And so what we've seen since then, I think, is basically just legal gamesmanship or whatever you want to call it. But the administration basically is pushing back on bringing him back, like the language that the press secretary, Carolyn Levitt, has been using to describe Garcia. Actually, it's not just Carolyn Levitt, but like the administration at this point, referring to him just as gang member, saying like things like, we thought he was you would think that we arrested the father of the year, like just degrading language, like saying that, trying to basically say like he's not a Maryland father. Guy's a Maryland father of 3 special needs children, married to a U.S. citizen, like here legally. And so I just wanted to talk about that for a second because, the fact that we have this 9-0 ruling, and what the administration is basically saying is because Garcia is currently located in El Salvador, they are outside the United States, and therefore they are outside of the United States judicial jurisdiction, right? So they're saying that because it's no longer in the U.S., that our courts don't really apply to the El Salvador or that location, right, in El Salvador. And so, yeah, I wanted to talk about that for a second for a few reasons. One, like just a 9-0 ruling that is currently not being followed by the administration, or they're dragging their feet on trying to follow it in any way. And then 2, just this whole concept of a legal black hole existing outside the U.S. where you can apparently just send people to and say, hands off, I have no power, like, right? Like this government that supposedly is the most powerful and influential in the world, and now they have no power to bring somebody back that they have admitted was a mistake to deport in the first place. So any thoughts, anything that I got wrong from you guys following that, or any thoughts from your perspective on this case?
I mean, so many thoughts. Yeah, I don't know. Arthur, you want to go?
The first thing is like not even like slow moving, like dragging their feet on this. I saw Trump on Fox like openly deny the Supreme Court ruling and flip it and say that he actually won it 9-0, and that if you quote watch the news, you wouldn't know that. That's so scary for like a sitting president to deny a Supreme Court ruling and claim victory. And that's what Pam Bondi, the
AG,
yes, AG Pam Bondi, whose brother, of course, just got out of prison. Trump pardoned him after he defrauded people. Pam Bondi's brother-in-law. Anyway, Pam Bondi used the same language of like, oh, it's not father of the year. He'll never live in the U.S. again. He's not here legally. He is here legally. Pam Bondi then posted on Twitter like the criminal rap sheet, and it's like, we're posting more info here. And the first thing it says is has no criminal record for Garcia, to clarify. And they're doing it now with like U.S. born citizens. And now the Supreme Court in May is going to hear oral arguments for birthright citizenship. That's in the Constitution. It's like, pull up the Constitution. It's like those born in the U.S. are citizens. What do you have to hear an argument about that for?
It's wild. The first thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about how they are portraying him in the media, not like he's father of the year kind of thing. It's like a textbook example. Think about all the Black Lives Matter protests and all these examples of young black men getting killed by the police, and then the media campaign that happens afterwards, which pictures they use when they talk about him in the media. They'll pick these weird teenage pictures holding guns up to try to make them look more sinister as if they deserved it kind of thing, or they'll pick a certain kind of mugshot. Regardless of what the legal situation is, building that story around the situation in the media is like a very active part of just watching propaganda happen in real time. They know that it doesn't really matter what the law says or what the courts are going to say. What's going to matter is how the public perceives the event. If the public believes their story, it doesn't matter about the Constitution and the Supreme Court, because we have a society built on concepts that only work if we all agree on them. And we're just kind of watching it break down in real time. Like, I don't know, it's so insanely silly and dangerous and deadly at the same time. You can watch the snowball get bigger and bigger and bigger every week. Who are they coming after next? Who knows? It's really insane.
Yeah. I think the other, Joe, you were mentioning how the story that they're trying to tell after the 9-0 ruling, like everything pivots to just attacking the person. Like even the Maryland senator that went down, what's it, Chris? Let me look it up.
Chris
It's like
Van Hollen.
Van Hollen. Yeah.
Chris Van Hollen. Yeah. So like after he announced that and said he was going down online, it was all like memes of him all tatted up as an MS-13 member and like all this craziness, right? They're attacking the person. They're not attacking the argument because they have no argument. There's no legal argument that actually makes sense in this scenario that they can like fall back on. And this whole thing of like, we don't have the power to bring him back. And then the president of El Salvador or whatever saying like, I'm not going to smuggle a person into the United States. Like they're being paid to keep these people down there by the US. Like we gave them money. Like, so like any argument they're making right now is just, I mean, bullshit. Like there's no real basis in any of this. And it's very obvious. So that's why they have to attack the messenger. They attack the person. They don't actually attack any kind of like legal argument there.
Definitely. And after tax day, it's like it's taxes that we're paying to keep these people there. And the Republican Party is paying the money. The Republican Party is essentially now involved in like kidnapping U.S. citizens legally here. Like, some U.S. citizens ICE is detaining, but in this case, of course, not born in the U.S., but legally here. And that's like, those are our tax dollars.
I'm just going to say, and just like we talked about with the On Tyranny book we discussed of how scary it is when local police forces and everything, like smaller military units, start collaborating with the federal fascists. Like you've got this collaboration, like people who want to do cruel things are gonna, I don't know, it's just, you watch the warning signs come into life and it's like, dang, it's already, it's here. It's not like, oh no, are we gonna become fascist someday? This is a fascist country. This is what it looks like.
And it's really scary. Like on that note, reading about ICE, like capturing people. And I read in Seattle, I believe, or maybe it was San Diego, an ICE agent got like their nose broken because now it's coming out, essentially if you get kidnapped by these people who don't have any sort of badge and don't identify themselves. And they use these tactics like I saw for kidnapping, these women, they actually have like women there to be present to try to calm them down. And so it's like, but if you get kidnapped from them, you're going to this prison in El Salvador and you're not going to come back. So it's like, it's a fight for your life right there. Don't go to a second location. And what's going to happen when that escalates to like somebody bearing a weapon? I think it's to your point, Joe, of like what you said, what we were talking about on tyranny and how most cops did most of the shooting.
Like that will happen. Like at some point, unfortunately, like it's just gonna like on this trajectory, there's no other way, like that something like that is not going to happen at some point.
I was just going to connect it to what Arthur was saying a minute ago about, we just paid taxes. When there's money changing hands in these situations, you have to really understand that like the government is taking I'm not opposed to taxes. I like taxes to support things like schools and healthcare and education, just taking care of people. But when you think about how much of your money the government uses for just abject violence and cruelty and evil shit all over the world, like your blood starts to boil. These are human beings and there's price tags attached to them and people are lining their pockets. It's not just that they're being mean to minorities, it's that they're doing it so that they can line their pockets. And, you look at Geo Group and these other for-profit industrialized prison situations, like it's modern day slavery. It really is in a crazy way.
So the only other thing I really wanted to talk about for this is like what happens next and the reason that this 9-0 ruling in this case for Kilmar García is so important. If this stands, right? Like if for some reason they don't bring back Kilmar García, like they go against this 9-0 court ruling and the Supreme Court does nothing about it, that opens up the door for Arthur, just like you said earlier, American citizens getting deported out and then all of a sudden having no way to bring them back, right? Because if we say this is a precedent, we have no method of bringing this person back despite the Supreme Court saying 9-0 that you have to do that, then that argument is what they're going to use when they deport, or not, it's not deporting, sorry. Deport is not the right word, when they kidnap people to this site in El Salvador, right?
Human trafficking is the term I was going to say.
That's a better
Yeah. We should,
better term to
yeah.
describe what's going on.
Yeah. We should explain it for people though. Like, because I think people hear it and they hear deport and they're like, oh, they're just leaving the country. But you can't deport somebody unless they're a dual citizen and you deport them to their original country. You can't deport somebody into a third party country into prison right away without due process.
That's the big thing. No due process. If they don't have to do it, even though these people are here, some of them are here legally, due process as part of the law, that applies to everyone. So yeah, it's super frustrating. And then, I don't know if you guys saw it, but when Bukele, the president of El Salvador, was in the Oval Office, the cameras were running a little bit before the official portion. And then there was a portion where Trump was basically talking to him and saying, you can't quite hear the initial portion, but then you hear him say something homegrown. Trump says homegrown. And then he turns to everyone else in the room and he's like, what I said is we need like 5 more of these prisons because we need to start going after the homegrowns. What he means by homegrowns is he means Americans, like the people that are in America that he doesn't want to be here. And everyone in the room clapped. So if you're curious or not completely convinced that's the direction they're going, there's a lot of evidence out there. I'd say just, look into it a little bit. So that's something that we're going to have to keep watching and how that develops for the next couple of weeks. Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors.
There was a time when the American dream meant something simple: a home, a job, a decent life for your family.
Some say that dream was made possible by the New Deal, unions, public programs, and a government that looked out for the common man.
But we know better. That dream was never sustainable.
Because stability creates complacency. And equality? That just gets in the way of ambition.
Today, the dream isn't about comfort. It's about winning, wealth, influence, the power to shape the world, or buy it.
The Liberty Institute, we believe in a dream built on ownership, not fairness, on markets, not morals, on tradition, redefined as dominance.
Forget pensions. Forget healthcare. Forget the picket fence.
The new American dream is, don't get left behind.
The Liberty Institute, reclaiming the dream for those who can still afford it.
The Liberty Institute is funded by undisclosed donors and governed by unelected strategists. Your dream may not be compatible with the current economic system. I thought for the main segment, we could talk a little bit about this book, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. In our show notes, I linked the PDF for the first chapter. I made a bunch of scans for my students and it was easy. So I don't want to sit here and like read the whole chapter, but there are a handful of things that I wanted to point out. Do you guys have any experience with this book or with this person? How much should I go into?
I've read the book before, but it was in college. And at the same time, I was reading Guns, Germs, and Steel, maybe. What is that guy's name? Diamond or something?
I think so.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I was curious about, do people have critiques of Zinn? Is this like, that was where my kind of mind went to, because I read it and I obviously have a bias towards really liking it. So I'm just curious what like components of the anti-Zinn, would say. But yeah, I definitely read it and enjoyed it a lot.
I bought it when we started talking about it, and it's sitting next to me, and I haven't opened it. I have too many books.
So many books like that at home. That's like the craziest thing about going to school is you accumulate all these books and then never read most of them. I have so many unread books.
So many books.
So yeah, Zinn, I guess what I could say, well, have you guys heard of, this is a random connection, mindfulness-based stress reduction sort of technique started by a guy named Jon Kabat-Zinn? At MIT, he started in the 80s. It's like the main American strand of mindfulness teaching, Jon Kabat-Zinn. The only reason I'm bringing it up is because I thought that their names were coincidentally the same. No, Howard Zinn's daughter married Jon Kabat, at which point he became Jon Kabat-Zinn and started the most famous mindfulness stress reduction clinic in the States.
He took her last name.
Yeah, they hyphenated it.
That's cool. It's cool. Okay.
I thought that was neat too. I didn't expect that to be the case. But Howard Zinn was kind of like he's a World War II vet. He flew bomber missions in Europe and has kind of reflected on that as far as like, wasn't really sure I was just looking through random interviews with him and stuff today and yesterday. The comments he was making about those bomber missions he flew in Europe is like, at the time, he thought it was strange because their targets felt kind of random. They didn't feel super precise. And like in the 80s and 90s, he went and interviewed people from those towns and found out that several thousand civilians died on that mission that he flew over those towns, and him trying to grapple with the guilt and the complicity and all that. But he is, I would say, a very strong socialist thinker in the American tradition. So probably heard Bernie Sanders talk about Eugene V. Debs as one of his political heroes, and it's the same for Howard Zinn. Before the USSR, before all these European models for socialism existed, there was a strong political strain for socialism in America. And like a lot of times we tend to think about these more leftist ideas coming from other places and infiltrating our cultural ideologies. But one of the things he makes abundantly clear in the book is how tapped into sort of working class movements American politics has been involved with that since the beginning. And so I think he typically, from what I saw yesterday, described himself as a democratic socialist. Sometimes he'd say I'm an anarchist, sometimes a socialist. Usually he'd say I'm a democratic socialist. So a socialist who wants to achieve it through voting and making decisions together rather than authoritarianism. And I think for myself, I tend, because within the left, there are more authoritarian examples as well as more anarchic examples. I tend to lean more towards the anarchist side of that, as well as not as, anarchy gets a bad rap as being associated with chaos, which I think is propaganda. If you think about our international system already, it's already an anarchic system. We have the biggest military, but officially speaking, we're all on an equal playing field, just sort of negotiating with each other. That's what anarchy is individual groups that none of which have power over the others, and they're sort of negotiating how to live in society with each other. I think you can achieve a lot of the goals of socialism, and you might even say communism, without having a strong, big nation-state apparatus. You can do it in a more decentralized way. That's my hope for a distant future anyway. But Howard Zinn, very much in line with that kind of thinking. Pro-working class, not a big fan of authoritarianism, and not a big fan of violence. Spent a lot of time in the 60s and 70s and like anti-war movements and things of that nature. And intellectually, in the 60s and 70s, there was a big shift with historians and how they were looking at things. They were coming to terms with the approach we've taken so far with history has been way too one-sided. We really have to think about what these other groups have gone through and try to narrate the past through the perspective of those experiences. What is the perspective of the American South through an enslaved person who was taken from Africa, or through a Cherokee who was dispossessed of their ancestral homeland? And so really trying to think through what history looks like from those perspectives. That's what he does a lot of trying to do in this book. And so what I wanted to talk about today was really the first chapter and really just a few sections of the first chapter. A lot of it has to do with Christopher Columbus and those initial voyages across the Atlantic, what was going on there. A lot of it also has to do with what is history, what's our relationship to it, how do we write it, things of that nature. And then also in a more general sense, what is colonialism in the Western Hemisphere? What is this history we've inherited as Americans? Where did it all come from? That kind of thing. The main sources in this first chapter, especially when it concerns Columbus, are Columbus's personal diary, which has been translated and digitized. I actually looked it up the other day. It's on the Library of Congress website. You can click through Columbus's diary and read through. On one of the second or third return trips Columbus made when they colonized Cuba, there was a Catholic priest that joined that expedition named Bartolome Las Casas. That priest wrote an account of his time in Cuba. Mainly the sources that Zinn is pulling from in these sections, either from Columbus's diary or from what that Catholic priest wrote about, just sort of reflecting on his journey. I think that Catholic priest was the one who translated Columbus's diary. I'm not sure if that's the same guy or not. So first of all, I want to take it in chunks and not just do a bunch of reading. I want to do a little bit of reading and give space for reactions or commentary if you guys have anything. This first section is just Columbus's original introduction to the New World, right? You can imagine Columbus sailing across the ocean, finally reaching land. This is the beginning of the first chapter that sort of paints that scene. And this is Zinn writing. He says, Arawak men and women, that's the name of the native people who lived in what's now Puerto Rico. Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches and swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore, carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawaks ran to greet them, brought them food, water, and gifts. Columbus later wrote of this in his log. He said, they brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. That's from Columbus's diary. And Zinn says, these Arawaks of the Bahama Islands, I was wrong about Puerto Rico, these Arawaks of the Bahama Islands were much like Indians on the mainland who were remarkable for their hospitality, their belief in sharing. European observers said this again and again about different native groups. These traits did not stand out in the Europe of the Renaissance, dominated as it was by the religion of popes, the government of kings, the frenzy for money that marked Western civilization, and its first messenger to the Americas, Christopher Columbus. So right off the bat, just that first sort of journal entry, introduction, hey, what are these new people up to? You have one group of people who are like, new people, let's make friends. Let's give you everything we got. We got lots of cool stuff. You wanna have some of this stuff? And then Columbus is like, I see an opportunity here. My students always think that's sort of an interesting first jump in.
Yeah, like the 50 minute, like the whole thing that he's talking through until he gets to that last sentence, like you could feel like that'd be like that entire lead up could also be like, these would be great people for us to work with, or like first people in the country. Like, man, we're so lucky we found this group. And it's like, no, 50 men, we can take them over. We got this. Don't worry about that. Jeez, that's depressing.
One interesting note, I'll just sort of summarize it, I guess, and start reading it. On their way to land, there was this thing on the ship where it was like, whoever spotted land first was supposed to get 10,000 maravedis for, I don't know if that's like a Spanish coin at the time or whatever. And there was a guy who like spotted the birds or whatever and said, yeah, I spotted or whatever. Columbus was like, no, I actually saw that last night. Columbus took the reward for himself. All right. A couple of paragraphs here. So approaching land, the Spaniards with Columbus, they were met by the Arawak Indians who swam out to greet them. The Arawaks lived in village communes, had a developed agriculture of corn, yams, and cassava. They could spin and weave, but they had no horses or work animals. They had no iron, but they wore tiny gold ornaments in their ears. This was to have enormous consequences. It led Columbus to take some of them aboard ship as prisoners because he insisted that they guide him to the source of the gold. He then sailed to what is now Cuba, then to Hispaniola, which is what we call Haiti and the Dominican Republic now. There, bits of visible gold in the rivers and a gold mask presented to Columbus by a local chief led to wild visions of gold fields. On Hispaniola, out of timbers from the Santa Maria, which had run aground, Columbus built a fort, the first European military base in the Western Hemisphere. He called it Navidad for Christmas, and left 39 crew members there with instructions to find and store the gold. He took more Indian prisoners, put them aboard his 2 remaining ships. At one part of the island, he got into a fight with Indians who refused to trade as many bows and arrows as he and his men wanted. 2 were run through with swords and bled to death. Then the Nina and the Pinta set sail for the Azores in Spain. When the weather turned cold, the Indian prisoners began to die. So part of what he was given, like as his job from the Spanish crown, was to find gold and slaves. Those were like the 2 commodities they wanted, gold and slaves. So when he struggled to find gold, he would just round up a bunch of indigenous people to try to bring them back. And a lot of them died along the way. And it was, you can imagine how miserable that was.
Was this like the Atlantic slave trade before it was like bringing slaves to America?
Yeah.
Isn't it just like the pre-Atlantic slave trade?
What would you, I'm trying to think of I can't think of a funny word for it, but how do you call it in business when there's like a disruptor or something like that? But Columbus was the first one to figure out, you can make money by taking people across the ocean and selling them or whatever. But yeah, he kind of set the groundwork. Okay, so I'll just summarize a little bit, there's a lot of that going on. Columbus made a lot of trips back and forth. The gold was really hard to find because there actually wasn't there weren't huge gold deposits. There was just little trace amounts in the river. But they set up these small military installments on all these islands in the Caribbean, and charged the indigenous people there find gold or die, basically. And so a lot of them started like hiding in the woods and not showing up. And they were supposed to wear little talismans or something if they had found gold. And so when Spaniard soldiers would find indigenous people that didn't have that on, they would get their hands cut off. And like, there are a lot of different estimates about how many people inhabited these islands before time, but at least several million people just went extinct within a few decades. Like, the death rates are very, very bad for all of this initial history. So skipping over a lot of the details of that to where he starts to talk more about history. Zinn says, thus began the history 500 years ago of the European invasion of the Indian settlements in the Americas. He explains why he continues to use the word Indian because of what Columbus was trying to do. He thought he was going to India. That beginning, when you read Las Casas, the Spanish priest I mentioned, even if his figures are exaggerations, is a history of conquest, slavery, and death. When we read the history books given to children in the United States, it all starts with heroic adventure, there is no bloodshed, and Columbus Day is a celebration. That's kind of changing recently. This book originally came out in the 80s during the Reagan administration. It's been updated to include stuff through the Clinton administration, but originally it was published in the 80s. So a lot of schools are contesting that Columbus Day narrative. I remember when I taught high school, I told my students to call it Indigenous Peoples Day, and I gave a little bit of an explanation of why. So I think that is changing to a good degree. Past the elementary and high schools, there are only occasional hints of something else. So now he's going to talk about some other historians. Samuel Eliot Morison, the Harvard historian, was the most distinguished writer on Columbus, the author of a multi-volume biography, and was himself a sailor who retraced Columbus's route across the Atlantic. In his popular book, Christopher Columbus, Mariner, written in 1954, he tells about the enslavement and the killing. He says, quote, the cruel policy initiated by Columbus and pursued by his successors resulted in complete genocide, end quote. That is on one page, buried halfway into the telling of a grand romance. In the book's last paragraph, Morison sums up his view of Columbus. Again, he's quoting Morison. He says, he had his faults and his defects, but they were largely the defects of the qualities that made him great. His indomitable will, his superb faith in God and in his own mission as the Christ bearer to lands beyond the seas, his stubborn persistence despite neglect, poverty, and discouragement. But there was no flaw, no dark side to the most outstanding and essential of all his qualities, his seamanship. End quote. And Zinn goes on, one can lie outright about the past, or one can omit facts which might lead to unacceptable conclusion. Morison does neither. He refuses to lie about Columbus. He does not omit the story of mass murder. Indeed, he describes it with the harshest word one can use, genocide. But he does something else. He mentions the truth quickly and goes on to other things more important to him. Outright lying or quiet omission takes the risk of discovery, which, when made, might arouse the reader to rebel against the writer. To state the facts, however, and then to bury them in a mass of other information, is to say to the reader with a certain infectious calm, yes, mass murder took place, but it's not that important. It should weigh very little in our final judgments. It should affect very little what we do in the world. It's not that the historian can avoid emphasis of some facts and not of others. This is as natural to him as to the map maker who, in order to produce a usable drawing for practical purposes, must first flatten and distort the shape of the earth, then choose out of the bewildering mass of geographic information those things needed for the purpose of this or that particular map. My argument cannot be against selection, simplification, emphasis, which are inevitable for both cartographers and historians. But mapmaker's distortion is a technical necessity for a common purpose shared by all people who need maps. The historian's distortion is more than technical, it is ideological. It is released into a world of contending interests where any chosen emphasis supports some kind of interest, whether economic or political or racial or national or sexual. Furthermore, this ideological interest is not openly expressed in the way a mapmaker's technical interest is obvious. For example, this is a Mercator projection for long-range navigation. For short range, you'd better use a different projection.
No, it is presented as if all readers of history had a common interest which historians serve to the best of their ability. This is not intentional deception. The historian has been trained in a society in which education and knowledge are put forward as technical problems of excellence and not as tools for contending social classes, races, or nations. To emphasize the heroism of Columbus and his successors as navigators and discoverers, and to de emphasize their genocide is not a technical necessity, but an ideological choice. It serves unwittingly to justify what was done. My point is not that we must, in telling history, accuse, judge, condemn Columbus in absentia. It is too late for that. It would be a useless scholarly exercise in morality. But the easy acceptance of atrocities as deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress. You can think of Hiroshima and Vietnam to save Western civilization, Kronstadt and Hungary to save socialism, nuclear proliferation to save us all. That is still with us. One reason these atrocities are still with us is that we have learned to bury them in a mass of other facts, as radioactive wastes are buried in containers in the earth. We have learned to give them exactly the same proportion of attention that teachers and writers often give them in the most respectable of classrooms and textbooks. This learned sense of moral proportion, coming from the apparent objectivity of the scholar, is accepted more easily than when it comes from politicians at press conferences. It is therefore more deadly. The treatment of heroes like Columbus and their victims, the Arawaks, the quiet acceptance of conquest and murder in the name of progress, is only one aspect of a certain approach to history in which the past is told from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, and leaders. It is as if they, like Columbus, deserve universal acceptance, as if they, the founding fathers, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, leading members of Congress, the famous justices of the Supreme Court, as if they represent the nation as a whole. The pretense is that there really is such a thing called the United States, subject to occasional conflicts and quarrels, but fundamentally a community of people with common interests. It is as if there really is a national interest represented in the Constitution, in territorial expansion, in the laws passed by Congress, the decisions of the courts, the development of capitalism, and the culture of education and the mass media. Henry Kissinger wrote that history is the memory of states in his first book, A World Restored, in which he proceeded to tell the history of 19th century Europe from the viewpoint of the leaders of Austria and England, ignoring the millions who suffered from those statesmen's policies. From his standpoint, the peace that Europe had before the French Revolution was restored by the diplomacy of a few national leaders. But for factory workers in England, farmers in France, colored people in Asia and Africa, women and children everywhere, except in the upper classes, it was a world of conquest, violence, hunger, exploitation, a world not restored, but disintegrated. My viewpoint, this is Zinn still, in telling the history of the United States is different, that we must not accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. In such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners. Thus, in that inevitable taking of sides which comes from selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to try to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, the story of the Constitution from the standpoint of slaves, the story of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, the story of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish, the story of the Mexican War as seen by the deserting soldiers of Scott's army, and the rise of industrialism as seen by the young women in the Lowell textile mills. The story of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, the conquest of the Philippines as seen by black soldiers, the Gilded Age as seen by Southern farmers, the First World War as seen by socialists, Second World War as seen by pacifists, the New Deal as seen by blacks in Harlem, and post-war American empire as seen by Latin America, and so on to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strained, can see history from the standpoint of others. My point is not to grieve for the victims and denounce the executioners. Those tears, that anger, cast into the past deplete our moral energy for the present, and the lines are not always clear. In the long run, the oppressor is also a victim. In the short run, the victims themselves, desperate and tainted with the culture that oppresses them, turn on other victims. Still, understanding the complexities, this book will be skeptical of governments and their attempts through politics and culture to ensnare ordinary people in a giant web of nationhood pretending to a common interest. I will try not to overlook the cruelties that victims inflict on one another as they are jammed together in the boxcars of the system. I don't want to romanticize them, but I do remember a statement I once read. He gets a quote here. He doesn't say who it's from. It's just kind of strange. The cry of the poor is not always just, but if you don't listen to it, you will never know what justice is. I don't want to invent victories for people's movements, but to think that history writing must aim simply to recapitulate the failures that dominate the past is to make historians collaborators in an endless cycle of defeat. If history is to be creative, to anticipate a possible future without denying the past, it should, I believe, emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, and occasionally to win. I am supposing, or perhaps only hoping, that our future may be found in the past's fugitive moments of compassion rather than its solid centuries of warfare. That, being as blunt as I can, is my approach to the history of the United States, and the reader may as well know that before going on. Long-winded section, but he gives a really detailed account of how he's approaching the history of the U.S.
Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors. What if I told you economic freedom was under attack?
Wait, is someone trying to take my money?
That's right. Hardworking billionaires like you are constantly threatened by unfair taxation, regulations, and ever-looming middle class.
I earned my fortune. Why should I have to share it?
Exactly. That's why the Patriot Prosperity Fund lobbies tirelessly to ensure that tax burdens fall exactly where they belong, on people with fewer lawyers.
Patriot Prosperity Fund is not liable for economic inequality, offshore tax evasion, or the eventual collapse of consumer spending power.
Any thoughts that came up while I was reading through that? Anything that stuck out you want to comment on?
I really liked the section where he talked about the moral weight we give these things and just adding the facts in and then just kind of like trucking through and trying to hide it. And then later when you're in a conversation with somebody, you can say, oh, I acknowledge the genocide. It's just like this, it's burying it. And that is really interesting because I think that is something in our education system that does happen. We are taught to equate facts and hold them all kind of equal. And yeah, there's been a lot of times in my personal education, I studied philosophy and political science, and in political science, it is a lot of people saying like, oh yeah, there's genocide. And then like, they'll move on just to the next topic right away. That is a little bit of ugliness to history. And I think the entire point of like having this different perspective from the occluded, is wonderful. More people should be writing from different perspectives of history because yeah, it is a creative endeavor. It's really cool. It's really cool that, I don't know, that guy just like mic drop,
Yeah. And I like the clarifying points too, because like he almost anticipates like what the reader is going to assume, like, oh, now we have to think of Columbus as this bad guy. We have to talk about all these bad. He's like, that's not the point. You're wasting your energy if you're sitting here obsessing about who the evil people in the past are. The point is to learn something from it so that you can change the future. So throughout the book, he's just like constantly pointing out how these desperate people are working together to try to overthrow the landlords in upstate New York, or, free the slaves, or, get land back for indigenous people. The point of understanding history is to change it for the future, not to just point fingers at people in the past and you're like, ooh, bad. That's easy.
I did have something I wanted to comment on there. I can't remember who the quote was from, Joe.
We must not accept the memory of states as our own.
Yeah. Okay. And what it made me think of was, I think there was a comparison to like a family or something like that, history of a family. And it made me think of if I went and asked all my family members about the history of our family, like how much of the dark shit would just not come up at all. It's like the unwritten rule, like it's family, we just don't talk about it, whatever it is, right? It was just interesting thinking about, if you think about our nation as that sort of thing. Like the people don't want America to look bad. Like if you're in a position of power where you represent the country, you obviously don't want it to look bad because it's the same thing as your family looking bad. So you're not going to talk shit on your family, right? I know it's not that simple, but that kind of comparison stuck out to me a little bit there.
No, I love that too, because like if you put whoever the president is as a stand-in for the dad of the family, if the dad is an abusive asshole and you ask the dad, hey, what's the history of your family? He's not going to mention what he's done. He's not going to talk about how he handles people who disagree with him. He's not going to talk about that. So yeah, just that allusion to the family, automatically most people who have a family with a complicated history understand that, like, oh yeah, all the dark shit, that's staying back there in the corner. Nobody's going to bring that up. So yeah, that's part of his point. You got to resist that. If you want to know all the bad stuff that's happened and how you can learn from it, it's important to resist that sort of family identity. At least provisionally, you can sort of bounce back and forth between the point of view, but a lot of stuff has been sort of stuffed in the closet.
Yeah.
Because of all
Well,
that.
the comment about like the president being the father, there's like so much that goes into that as far as, again, not to make another Nazi Germany comparison, but that was a huge part of German culture before going into World War II was like the father is the leader of the family, whatever he says goes, and Hitler is the Führer, he's the father of the homeland. And, if he has the power to control the nation, you as the father of your family have the power to control anything within your domicile. Like, and we're hearing that same thing. Tucker Carlson, I think, was like, oh, I can't wait. Daddy's coming home and he's going to take his belt or something. Like, but that he's not the only person saying that.
I think, yeah, one silver lining, I guess, with our current society is just the access to information, the internet culture that's developed is like, I feel like so many more people on average, especially younger generations, millennials and Gen Z especially, we are collectively much better at like clocking psychopaths when they say psychopathic shit. Like I think Tucker Carlson might think that most people think that sounds normal for him to say stuff like that, like daddy's back and he's going to bring his belt. And maybe there are, a subset of boomers who are like, hell yeah, whatever. But most people, I think even probably people who watch his show are like, it's a weird thing to say. I don't think they can get away with that publicly like they used to. Yeah, he spent a lot of time doing more history about not just what Columbus did, but other colonial missions. A lot of numbers about land taken and people killed and things very depressing like that. So sort of wrapping up the chapter, he says, so Columbus and his successors were not coming into an empty wilderness, but into a world which in some places was as densely populated as Europe itself, where the culture was complex, where human relations were more egalitarian than in Europe, and where the relations among men, women, children, and nature were more beautifully worked out than perhaps any place in the world. They were people without a written language, but with their own laws, their poetry, their history, kept in memory and passed on in an oral vocabulary more complex than Europe's, accompanied by song, dance, and ceremonial drama. They paid careful attention to the development of personality, intensity of will, independence and flexibility, passion and potency, to their partnership with one another and with nature. John Collier, an American scholar who lived among Indians in the 1920s and 1930s in the American Southwest, said of their spirit, quote, could we make it our own, there would be an eternally inexhaustible earth and a forever lasting peace, unquote. Perhaps there's some romantic mythology in that, but the evidence from European travelers in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, put together recently by an American specialist on Indian life named William Brandon, is overwhelmingly supportive of much of that myth. Even allowing for the imperfection of myths, it is enough to make us question, for that time and ours, the excuse of progress in the annihilation of races and the telling of history from the standpoint of the conquerors and the leaders of Western civilization. So that I thought was a good way to close, because for me, thinking about ways of looking, thinking about the points of view we take and the limitations on any given point of view, even all the stuff that we heard in this chapter comes from the perspective of Columbus's diary and a Catholic priest that was with him on his mission. Still, none of it comes from the perspective of the people who were conquered. And we're still just trying to approximate what their version of the history would look like. And so, yeah, I just kind of wanted to end with that as a reflection on what's missing when we only have so much to look at.
I think that's a good spot too, just because it kind of reemphasizes like that this is coming direct from Columbus. This isn't like a question or an interpretation of, what he was thinking.
Right.
His words, right? That subjugation is basically the first thing that came to his mind, right? Surprise at how generous and open they are, and then how do we subjugate them? Those are the two things that came to mind. Anything coming up that you guys want to plug or talk about? I'll start. This will happen before the episode comes out. This weekend, there's a group that put on an event for people to come down and speak. So it's basically like an open forum where everyone's going to be able to come down. You can actually reserve some time to speak and just kind of let your thoughts be known. So I think I'm going to go attend that this weekend just to make some connections there, meet some more people in the area. It's the Adirondack Voters for Change. They're doing that on Saturday at the same time that there is a lot of protests scheduled. I think, Arthur, you were just talking about, it's like follow on from the April 5th protests.
Yeah, it's the 51. I think there's like 400 events planned this weekend, the 19th. And most of them start in the morning or, noon. People gather. And kind of interesting, on the 20th is the whole Insurrection Act deadline of whether or not Donald Trump is going to invoke martial law. So I don't know if you want to talk about that too. But maybe the world will have changed by Monday again.
Yeah, I hope not. But, well, unless it's for the better.
I got whiplash at this point, just every day.
I know that on Saturday, remember when we all took the Capitol and we all took down the president and J.D. Vance and we instilled AOC as president just this last weekend. That's what I wish, we could all say.
If you put that out, then maybe it's just putting it into the universe.
Or like the counterterrorism czar is going to deport us for speaking ill of America.
Was it Gorka, the guy that did that, the counterterrorism stuff?
So
he's like a national security advisor or something like that.
Yeah.
I saw that too. How long before we get an email?
We should have a bet. Do you think we'll get an email from Russia asking to pay us? Or are we going to get an email from Homeland Security asking for us to leave? Which one comes first?
Or a lawsuit from Musk. We can make it a three-way.
As long as they all come at the same time, it's all good, Yeah. You have everything arranged. I was just going to plug book club. We started reading When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katz-Nelson on our Twitch channel at Propaganda Loves You. The preface and the first chapter are up now. I'll probably read the second chapter tomorrow morning. And then Saturdays at 10:30 Eastern, I'll continue reading. So we'll be doing 3 book club episodes on this book. So if you're interested in learning about the history of affirmative action and how it strategically was manipulated by Southern Democrats to benefit white people and actually expand the wealth gap between black and white people in the 1930s and 40s. Stay tuned for book club. Lots to learn there. That first chapter was wild, though. I haven't reading it and like, oh my God, this is crazy.
Yeah, I've read some Ira Katz-Nelson, others just like political science, and it's really well written. I really like the voice and all the context. I think he's a really good writer.
Yeah, I mean, clearly like a trained academic, he does a good job. And I was also just going to mention the preface is kind of short, like maybe 6 pages or so, but it's a great example of like a very academic book thing to do, of just like explain your whole argument for the book, explain all the sources in the field that have already talked about the issue and that you're sort of building on their arguments, sort of describing the conversation your book is about to enter. I just thought as potential book writers, it's a good example of a thing to do at the beginning of a book, just to sort of set the context and the frame for the whole thing.
Speaking of book club, we don't have a date for when we're going to release the episode or episodes on tyranny, but as soon as we got that, we will put that online. Also, if you're enjoying the show, by all means, give us a rating and follow us on whatever podcast listening service you use. That really helps the show get seen in different charts so that we get more visibility and more listeners. And find us online at Blue Sky, at Propaganda Loves You, or Substack. I think that's all we got for the week.
Stay informed, not influenced. And remember, propaganda loves you.